Welcome to episode 239 of the Brainy Business, Understanding the Psychology of Why People Buy. In today's episode, I'm excited to introduce you to Luke Freeman, Executive Director of Giving What We Can. Ready? Let's get started.
You are listening to the Brainy Business Podcast, where we dig into the psychology of why people buy and help you incorporate behavioral economics into your business, making it more brain-friendly. Now here's your host, Melina Palmer.
Hello, everyone, and happy day after Thanksgiving to those of you in the States. My name is Melina Palmer, and I want to welcome you to the Brainy Business Podcast. In today's conversation, I'm joined by Luke Freeman, who is the Executive Director of Giving What We Can, an organization dedicated to creating a culture where people are inspired to give to the world's most effective charities. What does an effective charity mean? Don't worry, we'll talk about that later on today. Giving What We Can was one of the first organizations in the world focused on effective altruism, the project of using evidence and reason to figure out how to best help others and taking action on that basis. I asked Luke to be on the show today to talk specifically about behavioral science concepts and how they line up with nonprofits. Sometimes concepts perform exactly as they would in a traditional customer-company relationship when there's money being exchanged. But in other cases, research has found that doesn't exactly work the same in a nonprofit situation. When people are volunteering or donating, some tactics that would show you're grateful or appreciative of a customer, like giving a gift, may backfire and feel off. Knowing this is a time of year where people who work in nonprofits or volunteer on boards are gearing up for year-end asks or doing strategic planning for next year, and others may be thinking of their annual donations, it seemed like the perfect time for this episode to help everyone be more effective with their support of others now and into the future. So before you do any of that stuff, listen to this episode first and share with someone you know who's on a board or works for a nonprofit to really help spread the word so we can all be more effective in our donations. Before we jump into the conversation, I want to remind you that there are links in the show notes for everything, including related past episodes, books, articles, ways to get in touch with Luke, and to learn more about Giving What We Can in the show notes for this episode. It's all waiting for you within the app you're listening to and at thebrainybusiness.com/239. And with that, let's jump right in. Luke Freeman, welcome to the Brainy Business Podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Great to be here.
Yeah. So just to kick things off, if you can share for everyone who doesn't yet know you a little bit about your background and the work that you do.
Yeah. So my background is actually in marketing for most of my career. And then most recently, I moved into the not-for-profit sector where I lead the organization Giving What We Can, which is a community of effective givers who try and make giving effectively and significantly a cultural norm.
Yeah. And so how does behavioral science fit into that and the work that you do? Is it just a passion project kind of on the side, something that you've liked or, how does that fit into your work?
Yeah, well, it's actually interesting. Behavioral science was one of the reasons why I became a member of Giving What We Can back in 2016. So I'd been reading a lot of behavioral science. This is kind of back in 2012, 2011, and about things like the kind of hedonic treadmill. As you increase your income, your expenses will often increase to that level as well. And at the same time, I was thinking about the value of money as well, like the marginal impact of money on your own well-being. And I was quite aware of a lot of the issues that the world was facing. And so I decided that I wanted to give a pretty meaningful part of my income to help others at a time when I'd gone from very quite low income to a reasonable income so that I wouldn't notice the difference. And I'm noticing that my income is going up, even though at the same time I'm giving a lot more to help others than I had previously given. So it's actually the behavioral science background led me to decide to give a pretty significant chunk of my income to helping others. And then when I went to do that, I was like, well, I really care about that going as far as it can, which is not a very common charitable behavior. Often people are quite driven by what's immediately in front of them, but I was a bit of a nerd and really cared about impact more than necessarily anything else when I was trying to give. So I then found the early work of Giving What We Can and another charity evaluator called GiveWell, and then started to act on that advice. And then many years later, after giving in this way, the organization was looking for an executive director. I had executive experience and also growth experience. So it was great to be able to come on board and lead an organization that is doing work that is really important to me.
Yeah, that's awesome. And just to elaborate a bit on what you were talking about, and I saw this in some of the materials you sent me in advance too, and I want to make sure that, because I think there was something really important, like you were saying, on that giving as effective, as effectively as you can, which what I hear with that and what you were saying is potentially there's that maybe like an availability bias, or like the most popular ones, the ones we hear about a lot. It feels like that's where we should be giving our money because that's what you do, right? This is the name I've seen a lot. So this feels safer to me, maybe than something else. But those that are most known might not have your dollars or whatever type of currency you're working with, might not go as far. So can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah. So there's typically when people go to give to charity, they are giving, as you said, to things that are right in front of them or things that they have had some experience with. However, like when we take time to actually reflect, most of us come down to the fact that what we care about is improving lives or saving lives, or like kind of quality or duration or whatever of lives, whether it be humans or animals, and whether that's happening now or later down the track. Generally, what we care about is how good lives are. And when you take a step back and think about things from that perspective, you find that there are just huge differences in how much any particular charitable intervention actually improves lives. In fact, when they've studied a lot of social interventions, many of them don't turn out to work at all, and some of them turn out to do harm once you actually apply some rigorous methodology. So when you're in the category of ones that even do improve lives, say, for example, looking at public health interventions in developing countries, even that you end up with kind of 2 orders of magnitude. So like 100 times difference between the median and the top ones, and then same in the other direction. So it's kind of from 100 times better or 100 times worse, depending on what you pick. So this is just like incredible numbers. So like that was just really eye-opening to me. But when people start to think about charity effectiveness, generally the 2 things that they think of are, one is things like overheads or administrative costs. And that's, it kind of ties into the evaluability bias. So it's very easy to go, oh, this charity spends, 10% or 30% or 5% on administration, and think administration is bad. That could be your office space, or it could be also things like actually evaluating their programs. So spending money on evaluating their programs increases the overhead. It decreases the amount they're able to spend on their programs, but that increases the effectiveness of their programs. So there are things like Charity Navigator, for example, is well known in the space in the US for kind of sucking in a lot of information from legally required documents like tax filings and stuff like that. Just looking at kind of category names and then spitting out numbers like overhead ratio. And that's what people often think about when they think of effectiveness. But that doesn't tie back to impact as much. So when people think about impact, it's actually a lot more to do with the intervention. So, for example, imagine there's a charity that was entirely volunteer run. It had a lot of its supplies that were needed for the intervention donated. And so that for every dollar, someone donated, there was, $100 worth of the intervention given out. But if it turned out they were giving massages to millionaires, and what was donated was some massage oil, the impact of that intervention may not be incredibly high, even though it might be very kind of operationally efficient.
Yeah, interesting. And I hope that charity doesn't exist.
No, I have to be very particular with giving fictional examples, because I try not to rag on any particular charity. Because ultimately, I think I am so supportive of anyone trying to do good. I think that's the first bar you've got to get people, is to look outside of themselves and try and improve the lives of others. But once you're there, really narrowing in on that impact and trying to find just the things that are going to do a huge amount of good, and make sure that at least those things don't go unfunded.
Yeah. Well, and I think it was important also, just so I end every episode of the podcast with be thoughtful. And that's my email signature. That's like my thing. Right. And I think being more thoughtful about where you choose to give money and why you're giving money, and looking, or time, or whatever it is with an organization, and knowing, what is it that you want to be doing or working towards. So there was an example in one of the papers that you sent, or it might have been off of a website, but it was talking about, the cost for training a seeing eye dog versus this particular surgery that was able to counteract or prevent people from going blind, essentially, right? Do you know this like off the top of your head to be able to grab and mention, or do you want me to kind of keep going?
Yeah, I think it's around the order of $40,000 to $60,000 to train a seeing eye dog, which can help one person for a few years, versus very conservatively $1,000 for cataract surgeries, but even cheaper if you're not as conservative on those estimates, which is more like what the seeing eye dog stuff is. So we're talking here at least a 40x, if not more of like 100 or 200x improvement in terms of the number of people who you could restore sight for completely versus helping improve their life while they're without sight.
Right. And I think it is just important. So actually, I had a friend growing up who trained seeing eye dogs, and so got to be, part of that experience in helping to train the dogs. I wasn't allowed to have a dog at the house myself, so I would always enjoy. And she trained, 2 or 3, or more of the dogs over time, and that is important. And there are some people where the correct surgery or something, it won't help them, right? So we still need this other piece. But like when you look at how you want your money to be spent, like looking and not just saying, oh, this is the right thing because this is the thing everyone's talking about, so that must be where my money should go. But just taking a moment to say, what do I care about? Whose life or lives am I looking to impact, and why? And what's going to be the best use of whatever money that I'm putting out there can help, so that where the other charity, not the seeing eye dog one, but maybe people don't even know about it all that much. And you can have, if you only have, and I think in the example it was saying $200, but say you have $200 to give, and that could help one person, and it's not going to go as far on the other side if you don't have $40,000 to give, which I'm guessing a lot of people don't.
Yeah, things can go just a lot further. And this is a key thing that we often find when you're seeking out super high impact interventions, is one of the 3 criteria we often look at is neglectedness, because popular problems are often getting a lot of resources already. Because people are aware of them, and they're in front of their faces, and you're getting also some level of bandwagon effect as well. People sometimes want to be part of the moment. And we see that with things like disaster relief giving. It's great that people jump in. I love that it activates people to think about what's going on in the world. But sadly, there is often kind of inundated with things that don't necessarily need, especially sending stuff. So people, there are just so many cases like there's a disaster, people try to send stuff to the place, like clothes or something like that. And then they just inundated with stuff they can't really do much with, when what they need is, much higher context solutions that are often quite complicated. And even better is prevention. And so there are a lot of stuff that's really neglected because it fits into the prevention space. So it's a lot harder to market charities, the behavioral side of things. You've got things like the identifiable victim effect. So if you show a single person who you could help, you said in a position where which is often quite demeaning. So if you show a video of a starving child in Africa and say, this person's going to go hungry if you don't give now, people are more likely to give right away out of a sense of guilt often, or pity, but that's not necessarily sustainable giving over the long term. And it is also doesn't bear on the scale of the problem. And sometimes there are just some very, very big problems, which if you just show the scale, also that kind of can be defeating as well, because people go, oh, this is just too much. My donation isn't going to make a difference. But at the end of the day, there is really strong data to know that there is the impact of your donation can really scale, and you can have quite an outsized impact, especially if you're someone from a country like America or Australia, where we're in the top 5% of global earners. And if you're middle income in these countries, you're more likely to be in the top 2% of global earners. So, and looking at the marginal impact of money on well-being, you're really hitting diminishing returns in places like where we live. Whereas in many places in the world, that's, the money that's the difference, what we might spend on a coffee or not, is the difference between all of our expenses for the day, whether we eat or not, or whether our kid goes to school. And you see this in other fields as well, in the environment, in animal welfare, in things that might affect the future as well.
Yeah. So building on that, then, I'm sure, and as I mentioned to you in wanting to do this episode, is knowing that, people have been finding that there is a difference in the way that when we apply behavioral science concepts to a traditional buying relationship, when people are paying money to get goods or services, the tactics and concepts work in a particular way. And they don't necessarily go exactly the same way when we're looking at for nonprofits or whatever, in that charitable space. Sometimes things that work, we don't like to get a gift. I know from when I did the first episode on reciprocity, if you give people a gift when they've given a donation, sometimes that can actually backfire, and that they feel like, well, I was just giving because I wanted to, but now you kind of made it weird.
It's now a financial transaction.
Yeah, right. So for anyone who's listening who is with a nonprofit organization, whether they're on a board or they're an executive director or whatever else, and they're looking for creating their messaging, what tips and insights do you have of things that was there anything they definitely should do and anything they definitely should not do?
Yeah, so there's a lot there. And the other thing that's interesting is I would just want to flag up front that because a lot of the work that I'm doing is within a segment of donors who really care about impact, what we find works for us is different to what works for the sector at large. And some of these things are fighting against the stuff that I care about in a sense. So if I care about impact, for example, that's something you want to affect a lot of people. But if what is better at raising money is to do things like show a single identifiable beneficiary in a state, which may not necessarily be giving them a lot of dignity. So there is this very soul-searching question that we have to ask when we are in the charity marketing space is, what kind of marketing do we want to do? What kind of behaviors do we want to enforce? And for example, people might care a lot around what percentage goes to the charity. So this is kind of the overhead myth, as I mentioned. So even just something like if there are credit card fees, charities often try and hide that, even though it's just a transparent cost of what it is. And by showing it to people, they're more likely to ask to do something like a bank transfer, which immediately might seem nice that you don't necessarily have the same fees, but the operational cost to the charity to reconcile that bank transfer may be more than the small fee that like a credit card provider charges. But we'll go through some of these. So yeah, there's this kind of general thing that donors want to feel confident in their donation. And so you've got things like they might be thinking about, well, can they see the impact, which is a very human way of doing it. We lean into, well, what's the evidence of the impact? But there's others that, things like showing that others have also given as well. Giving what we can. We have a variety of causes and it's hard to lean in. We try not to lean in too hard to any of them. So actually just showing other humans and why they give and why it's important to them. That's quite motivating. It's actually often more motivating to come from another donor than from the charity itself. So we encourage people to be public in their giving and not showy or anything like that. But for example, being willing to be on our website, but also being willing to use your own things like social media and conversations, because by hiding the fact that people give. Everyone assumes that everyone else isn't giving. And not talking about where we give. We don't get to have those conversations around what might be impactful or not, or what, and those stories that really motivate people don't get out there. So your donor base is super important when it comes to the success of the charity, and therefore, the beneficiaries and how much good you're able to do for them.
Yeah, a question building on that, actually. So, we've seen a lot over the years now that Facebook does for my birthday, I'm raising money for whatever else, and you can have that go up on your page or whatnot. I don't know how effective those sorts of things actually are for raising money or awareness about anything, or if they just sort of exist. But so like you're saying, so the social proof piece being really important, being able to see others doing things, and especially others like us, is going to make us be more likely, more people are more likely to donate if they see that other people are doing that as well. Do you have any thoughts on, or have you seen anything with where an organization may align themselves? So we have a lot of people who own their own businesses or whatnot that listen to the show, or working with large organizations, and having that corporation identify with and tie to a specific charity or nonprofit. Does that have an impact as well of being able to show, that value of that social proof in the same way?
Yeah, it works often more from the perspective of the organization. So sometimes it is valuable, like it's the classic you see on many websites, the as seen in here with the press and our partners and a list of logos. And if people recognize those or they seem legitimate, they click through, that is a sense of kind of validating, because trust, particularly with any online transaction, people are looking for trust signals, and that can be the fact that people have been willing to lend their brand and it backs up on their side of things. On the company side of things, it's a tricky one. There is some evidence that consumers, all things being equal, will prefer a company that has some kind of ethical practice. That being said, sometimes it backfires. We've seen this there was tests done on plant-based meats. I think it was Impossible or Beyond or something like that. And they had like environmental messaging versus just like taste messaging. And people were less likely to choose it when there was like, it's better for the environment. And there is reports about people thinking that the quality is going to be worse or anything like that. They're going to be charged more. But in some cases, if you get the right story, it can really work for the company in terms of their own sales as well. There is a tricky thing where often people really prefer that it be some kind of logical story that is told of why that charity or that cause makes sense for that company, which is great if you can tell that story. The tricky thing is sometimes charities are picked or causes are picked purely because there is like some tie into the company, and it may not necessarily be a great thing for people to give to. And the markup that they're paying, they would have just been better off donating that directly to a cause. For example, the case of Tom's Shoes, which you might be familiar with. They had the buy one, give one model. You buy a pair of shoes and they'll give a pair to a kid in Africa. The problem being that much of the time, shoes weren't what was needed. It was also disruptive to the local economy, to shoemakers and stuff nearby. They would often be sold at a heavy discount because they're kind of flooded with them. And then that money would be used for things that they actually really needed. And so you're kind of having a huge loss in the effectiveness of even the cost of giving the shoes. So it can be a double-edged sword trying to match a cause to a company. But I've seen companies do a really good job of this, even just saying that they give to some of the world's most effective charities, backed by strong evidence and vetted by trusted charity evaluators. There's kind of like that sense of trust comes in. And so we work with companies who've taken a company pledge to give 10% of profits to these high-impact causes. Sometimes they pick ones that, again, there is an easier story to tell. I've had people work in the health field. It's a lot easier to talk about improving health anywhere in the world. For example, we had Are You OK Day in Australia recently, and an organization was specifically looking to raise money around mental health, but they were able to find a great charity, Strong Minds, which is doing work in places like Uganda and doing group talk therapy, which has great evidence, and the scale that you're getting for being willing to just shift the beneficiary group to be women in Uganda just has this huge increase in impact that you're able to have.
Mm-hmm. So just like with any brand messaging, knowing like we both have backgrounds in marketing, when you can be specific and narrowing the story down, because our brains love nostalgia and stories. I'm going to be linking to that episode here. I tell people this all the time for anything you're pitching, to say there are 500,000 children in whatever location that are hungry, and that's important. Go, okay. Right. But then when you're able to follow the story of someone, like you said, and making sure we, of course, have to keep the human dignity in mind, but being able to say, this is Anne, her stomach is rumbling and she's trying to do her homework, but not sure if she's going to be able to, if she's going to have anything to eat tonight, and is just dealing with that pain or that struggle, and then, concern about it, and it impacted her ability to do her homework. And there are 500,000 other children just like Anne in our community. And, right, you can do the little bit of the story to help that to feel more real. And when you can tie back into why this matters to our organization, then that can be beneficial. What I'm hearing from you, both sides, right? So both finding a nonprofit that you really align with as an organization, and knowing that trust can kind of go both ways, and it can be a really mutually beneficial relationship, tying in with, a couple of really effective charities that align with what you do can be better than just, keeping it behind the scenes. A lot of organizations donate and don't talk about it, but it's better to be able to talk about it and have a reason.
Yeah. There are also things that just don't work that people think work. So
yes, please tell all this. Yes.
So, for example, trying to force snap judgments. So, people often try and get people on the spot, force them, get them in a situation where they're trying to get into intuitive thinking instead of deliberative thinking. And the classic is someone on the street asking you for donations. And that, doesn't increase behavior. I wouldn't be surprised if there's some level of reactance there as well, that people actually now I don't want to give to this organization ever.
Right.
But there's obviously, some people do give, but it's much less effective than other marketing methods, and it could actually be a net negative in terms of the fundraising of the organization. But they'll report, obviously, the money that did come in and therefore think it's working. There's also donation matching is a really popular one, but there's not a lot of strong evidence for that. It may not have much of an effect, even though it's something that people try and do a lot. There can be specific things that it helps with, say if it's to get to a certain point, or for example, it's to shift donation behavior. So if someone's about to give $50 and you say, if you make this a recurring donation, another donor will give an extra 50 or something like that. That may be more likely, but it doesn't necessarily change the donation behavior of will they give or not.
Yeah. And I've seen sometimes in that kind of where you're going to do the $50 one-time donation. And then if you were to say, hey, do you want to make this be $10 a month? And we'll switch you on to an auto recurring donation. How do you feel about that? And you're locked in for the first 5, but then it'll just keep going, but it feels a little bit better. As $10, you were thinking you were going to give 50, and then it can just go on. And essentially you get at least 120, or theoretically it just keeps going. Any thoughts on that sort of a reframe?
Yeah. So, that I think that's a good reframe. Generally speaking, the recurring donations, make a lot more sense for many donors who are particularly people of a typical income in countries like Australia or in the US. It's much more sustainable. It's much better for the charity. So if people care about, we don't want charities to spend a lot on marketing, well then don't make lots of small one-off donations, because each of them they're trying to convince you to do. Instead, have a budget for what you want to give. For example, like we recommend people think of it as a percentage of their income. In many cases, that's quite simple. Then you've got that budget and just give that amount. And on a regular basis, just like it'd come out, you get your paycheck, money goes out, you know what to predict. You've made that decision, you've been intentional, and you revisit that once in a while. But that means that the charitable sector in general is a lot more efficient and effective. And they're focusing less on trying to bring in new donors because if people have like more sticky donation behavior, but they're more intentional when they're going out to research, I think that's a good thing for the sector. It's a good thing for donors as well. Another one that there are like two things that I think may have come from The Art of Persuasion. What was the book? There's like a classic marketing book. I don't know if they came from that.
Influence.
I think it may have come from Influence. I think
Cialdini.
Yeah, Cialdini. And the other one I think was Ariely, Dan Ariely. I think these two like seem to work, but then just have not replicated to the same degree. And that's the door in the face technique. So where people request a large amount and then come back with a smaller amount. That hasn't really worked. People generally have an idea of what they want to give. You can maybe anchor a bit, but again, you may end up just like putting people off altogether. And then the other one is like artificial surveillance cues. So like placing a picture of eyes above a donation jar or something like that. It was like a weird result that like it was novel and people liked it, but it just hasn't really.
Yeah. So with the influence, so the door in the face and the foot in the door, I talk about in the reciprocity episode, which for everyone who's listening, as this episode comes out, I just had, the reciprocity one replay on Tuesday. So that's available for you to listen to. But, with that example, talking about context again, which is and generalizability of examples, which I always talk about on the show, is the example given there is not about money being donated. It's asking so it's the big ask of, do you want to be a volunteer for 2 years for this program? Random person, you're like, no, I don't want to do that. And say, oh, well, we're doing this, 2-hour, tour over with these kids. Would you be interested in doing that? And that more people would say yes when it was something to do with time or something. So that volunteering piece, which I know I mentioned to you that someone on LinkedIn just this last week was asking questions about some of these differences for nonprofits. And she shared, some questions about volunteering and trying to get people, to sign up for either memberships or to be more likely to be volunteers for you. Because I know that's something that a lot of organizations struggle with as well. Do you have any thoughts or insights or background or, things that you've seen that work with encouraging volunteerism with organizations?
Yeah. So volunteerism is something that I haven't focused on as much. It's an interesting one. We've had actually like heaps of volunteers come in with interest, and we have like a really wide spectrum of volunteers, like right from people who occasionally give an opinion or sign up and never kind of show up and do anything. And the opinions, even just giving an opinion on something can be quite helpful. We all know it's like, which title should we use for this email?
Yeah.
Yeah, that can be helpful if you get 20 people weighing in. But on the other extreme, we've had people who as I mentioned before we started recording, one of our volunteers is out here on our team retreat in Australia, who we ended up actually poaching him from his job for a few months on a smaller grant. And it started off with actually just recognizing their contribution and having that more human connection. I saw he was a UX designer, and I was like, if you have any feedback, I would always be ears. He then wrote back like a 2-page document and then went on from there, ended up redesigning our entire brand. So Alex, thank you.
Yay. Thanks, Alex.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. But yeah, the one thing to be careful of with volunteering is that the match between what the volunteers can bring and what the organization needs is a really hard thing to get right. And so volunteering strategies are going to be very specific to the organization's context. As we said before, context is everything. So mass mobilization, you're thinking about how do you get as much accurate information about volunteers that are like lowest cost to them. So for example, in the political advocacy or policy advocacy space, let's say you want to mobilize people to, there's an animal welfare policy, you want them to write to their MP or something. Well, you need to know like postcode level data of where they live or something like that. Give them a message they can use, make it really, and then don't spam them, like only send them the things that are really highly leveraged. But whereas like skilled volunteering, it might be, that type of example, which I mentioned, you have like a high fidelity connection with someone who like bought into the organization's values they're actively giving. But it is interesting. A lot of charities, their volunteering programs are actually a donor management, donor kind of nurturing program in disguise. So I've seen things where corporate volunteering, say getting people to come in and do some stuff on the ground, is more than anything, it's showcasing the work that the charity does. And then the people who corporates who come in and maybe help cook food for a day, they were like, the charity needed to hire like double the staff and everything they normally would to cook the same amount of food just to manage the corporates and make sure they didn't stuff anything up. But at the end of it, they had a bunch of people who now wanted to be donors. So there is a lot of volunteering does end up in that category, which is interesting as a not-for-profit to think about. It's how you want to use that information. Do you want to set up a program which is a donor like engagement program, which can be a great way of bringing people in, but if you're sitting there going, oh gosh, they do terrible work and this is costing us money to manage and everything like that, well, yeah. So it's, you don't expect people to come in from a white collar job and then do something that they have no idea how to do, because it turns out all work is skilled work. But sometimes those people may be better to have, maybe that's a great experience that buys them into the organization, but they might be better to recruit as, a board member or a member of an advisory board or something like that, where actually what's expected of them is that they host a dinner with friends and they get them to put some money on the line to like sponsor an entire program that you're going to run. So you can go, hey, this is going to cost, $100,000. We think it's really important. Are you able to, host? You're the kind of person who could maybe give $10,000. If you can get 10 friends, it would be great if you could actually make this happen entirely on your own. And maybe that's a better way of engaging with that segment.
Interesting. Yeah. And I think too, just from where I was hearing in there and having been on boards and things myself and done some consulting in this space, is just for any of it, don't get too hung up in thinking that the thing you're asking someone for is such a big deal, and don't go priming them into thinking it's going to be really hard or really expensive before you ask them for the thing, whatever the thing is, right? Like we were talking about the social proof and herding aspect. But if you say, oh, I know it's so hard to give money, but if you can, please, like, no, man, oh, it is hard. I can't do that. Right? Or, you can't volunteer because you've set it up this way and they might have really wanted to, but now you made them think it was too hard.
Yeah. Don't give people reasons not to do the thing you want them to do.
Yes, please.
But also appreciate after the fact when someone has done something. Or if someone can't do something, appreciate the fact that it may have been a big ask, and then come in with something which is, again, as we said before, the kind of the right way of doing the door in the face.
Right. Yeah. Yes. Can still, even if they say no to the big thing, it doesn't mean that they won't do a smaller thing. We use that opportunity. So for everyone who is, and we'll just frame this for those who are at a nonprofit or they advise to one, and if they were going to do one thing, we'll say before the end of the year, based on when this comes out. But of course, knowing this will be listened to for years to come. But for right now, if you do one thing in the next month before the end of the year, what's the one thing that you would say should definitely be on their radar of something to do as they're doing those like year-end asks?
Oh, it's a tough question because, as I said before, context is absolutely everything. I would say this is the one thing that comes back to everything I've done in marketing, behavioral science, and in the not-for-profit sector and in startups and everything is you really need to get in the head of your user. And in this case, that is a donor. And think about your existing donor base. They're the biggest asset that you have. What is it that they think about that they need? Why have they come? If you're looking to find more donors like them, or you're looking to get them to give more or to give again, tell them again what they have told you. For example, when we have people sign a giving pledge or giving what we can, we ask them why they did so. We said, I pledged today because, and they finish the sentence. And what people say there is so telling as to why they have given and why this is important to them. And so we know for our audience, showing that back to other people who might be similar and telling our members again that reasoning is what's really important. And for us, the thing that really resonates is that people are very aware of the relative luck that they might have, and that they really care that they are able to help others, and they want that money to go as far as possible. And so we hear that, we tell that back to them, and we try to live up to that. And I think that is, for us, what I found. And I think that's quite a universal principle.
Awesome. Okay, I've decided that I'm going to do something I've never done on the show, but it feels like the right time for them. And I've been asked these sort of things before. This is like our hot or not moment. Okay. So, live auctions, hot or not? As in like good to do or not good to do?
I've not done a lot of them in a long time, but in the right format, I think it really works. There's the energy in the room and stuff like that does really push people along.
Silent auction, hot or not?
I think it works as an augmentation. So if you're doing an event, it's the type of thing you have both. I think you hit both bases.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. And then we'll do the one last one-time like board member phone call out to random people asking for donations, hot or not?
Random people? I think not hot.
Previous donors? Yeah.
Someone in their Rolodex who's a really good prospect, definitely hot.
Okay. But if you were to tell the people on your board, call these 100 people that you've never met before and ask them to donate to us.
No. I think it's not a great
Probably not super
time.
Effective, right? All right. Things I've seen, like I said, from different organizations in the past. So, well, thank you for playing some of that with me. Got us through a couple of those other questions before wrapping up. So for everyone who is now wanting to learn more about you, and I know I mentioned that there were some articles and things that you sent me in advance. I will be linking to things in the show notes, of course. And for people who want to learn more about you and giving what we can, what is their next best step?
Yeah. So number one thing I recommend is always head to our website, givingwhatwecan.org. There we also have some reports on high impact causes. We have a list of top charities, which we recommend, as well as many guides for just how to think about charity. So how to decide between causes, how to select a charity. And then, if you want to be inspired, you can read, stories of people who have really taken this approach to giving, where impact is their goal, and generosity is a kind of key part of the way they live their life.
Perfect. And Giving What We Can is not just in Australia, right? You are...
in fact, we are international. We have members from, I think, 92 or 94 countries. And we're tax deductible in the US, UK, and the Netherlands. And we have a list on our website of other places where you can give to some of the places we recommend.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much, Luke, for coming on the show and just taking a tiny bite out of all the potential things we could have been talking about today. So thanks for starting this conversation. I think we'll have many more conversations into the future.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much. It's been really lovely.
Thank you again to Luke Freeman for joining me on the show today. What got your brain buzzing in today's conversation? For me, I bet you could guess that I love the idea of being more thoughtful before supporting the most popular organization you might see or hear about the most. Do they align with what you're hoping to accomplish? What does effectiveness mean to you anyway? How can your money go the furthest? And if you don't have money to give, where can you give time or other resources, checking first, of course, to make sure it's the best thing to send, to have the biggest impact? If we all were a little more thoughtful, the world would be a much better place. And speaking of being thoughtful and building on Tuesday's refreshed episode on reciprocity, I want to give a shout out to Kesia Stewart, Evaluation and Insights Manager at Cycling UK, who had serendipitously posted on LinkedIn as I was creating this episode, asking the question, how has behavioral science been used effectively in charities? The responses showed that there are a lot of people thinking about this right now and not enough content with the answers yet. So I'm glad this episode is coming out at the right time to hopefully help everyone answer those questions and to spur more conversation. Let's have more research in this area. Kesia and I had a little offline chat in the DMs to find out some more questions of areas she was interested in, which helped shape some of the conversation with Luke today. What about you? Do you want to hear more content about nonprofits and how behavioral science has been used or could be used in charities? What might you want to know about? What questions should I be asking next? And what type of people do you want on the show? Find me on social media to let me know. I'm the Brainy Biz pretty much everywhere, and you can find me as Melina Palmer on LinkedIn. I look forward to hearing from you and sharing more knowledge about behavioral science in nonprofits into the future. And don't forget, there are links to related past episodes like those on reciprocity, availability bias, framing, and more, all in the show notes for the episode, along with links to learn more about giving what we can and to connect with Luke, which are waiting for you in the app you're listening to and at thebrainybusiness.com/239. And thank you again to Luke Freeman for joining me on the show today. It was a delight to chat with and learn from you. Join me Tuesday to learn all about the pain of paying. It's going to be a lot of fun. You won't want to miss it. Until then, thanks again for listening and learning with me. And remember to be thoughtful.
Thank you for listening to the Brainy Business Podcast. Melina offers virtual strategy sessions, workshops, and other services to help businesses be more brain-friendly. For more free resources, visit thebrainybusiness.com.